Hello, my name's Kyle, and today I'm going to be talking to you about communications continuity. Specifically, communications continuity during a post-disaster sort of situation. So first we're going to talk about exactly what kind of situation we're looking at, then briefly look at options for reconnecting internet connectivity, and then we're going to dive into radio communications as a primary means of communication during a big disaster. Also look at the capabilities of radio, current users, and how to get involved yourself. So the type of disaster we're looking at would be a hurricane, earthquake, flood, something that would disrupt the normal means of communication with landline telephones and cell phones and things like that. So this is something where there's a disruption in power and disruption in normal means of communication, so you need something extra. So what extra do you need? In that situation, you would need something small that does not require a lot of power, and obviously that does not depend on the rest of the infrastructure being attacked. So the way to get that done with internet is generally with VSAT terminals, very small aperture terminals, which is a very small little radio dish like on this FEMA trailer here that can get internet just with a very small source of power. Here's one company that does this. You can get a fully self-contained trailer that will get you a half a mile radius of wireless connectivity. You can also direct that to other places, so you can get access at one point and direct the access to another place, technology called WiMAX. You can get the smaller versions that are less self-contained. You'd have to then get your own generator for it, but you know, it can be set up with one person. So that's very helpful. There are other, even smaller, less expensive versions of all this in other companies. This is 3DI Technologies. This one fits inside of a backpack, and these are marine systems capable of getting it on the move, but you can also mount this on a vehicle. The trade-off as you go down in price is you get less data transfer and less range on your equipment. But there are inexpensive ways to get small terminal and emergency rates priced as needed for getting internet access in the field. So those are some good options there, but of course 90% of your communication during disaster is going to be with your radio. So that's going to be voice messages, simple text message. You can also move data with radio. So here's an example of something you can actually do with an example of the capacity. You can get a radio with handheld radio with 20 to 30 miles of coverage, and you can get a repeater for less than $3,000 that'll repeat a signal for 40 miles. So that means if you stuck a repeater at each end of this map of New Orleans, because this distance here, this purple line is 18.5 miles. It means if you stuck a 40-mile repeater with a range of 40 miles at each end of this, that could carry a handheld radio signal from here to the repeater, to the next repeater, to another handheld radio over there. You cover the whole New Orleans area with 2 repeaters and a bunch of handhelds for pretty cheap, and get a pretty big area of coverage if you can get the idea of how this, again, this is 18 miles is that distance there. So there's a lot you can get with that. Other ideas of capabilities of radio, you can do voice over internet protocol, which means you can transmit the radio into a laptop and then transmit that data over the internet. So you can talk to anyone with a laptop with the same software with a radio from the field, so that you can then talk to anyone in the world that way. These are some of the examples of data rates you can use with public frequencies. You can also use mesh networks, which means that each node, each individual radio can act as a repeater. Even a handheld radio can do this. So that way, if these green circles are individual ranges of like handheld radios, Bob can't talk to Jane because she's out of range, but if every individual radio can repeat the signal, Bob can talk to Jane like this. And this is something that I wish we had when I was working as a firefighter, because what we always ran into was if we had people on each side of a mountain in neighboring valleys, and we couldn't reach a repeater. We couldn't talk to each other because we were out of line of sight. But so the way we did it was we played telephone. We stuck some guy on the top of the ridge, and we tell him the message, and he'd repeat the message to the guy in the valley, and then go back and forth and back and forth. Hopefully the message doesn't get confused in the way, but if there was a way to digitally just repeat the message through a handheld radio, that would have been very helpful for us. Today, current users, there's some amateur radio clubs that I interviewed in southeastern Louisiana, and these things exist across the nation. There's also the Coast Guard Auxiliary, which is an interesting group. They operate in the waterways in the United States, and they have a long-standing existence with the Coast Guard. They're developed in 1939, and they go through training, and they can actually access secure frequencies with the Coast Guard. So they can also transmit sensitive information in times of disaster. So this is a group that takes volunteers and that anyone can become involved with. So they're a great asset as well for any kind of emergency managers. These other amateur clubs, the Southeast Louisiana Amateur Radio Club, has also been very involved in disasters. This is Bob Prez, who I interviewed for part of this, and he told me about their involvement in Hurricane Isaac. Their repeater actually ran off of battery power for about a day and a half, and then they ran it off of generator power after that for the remainder of about 4 days until they got commercial power back on. And they were doing important communications based off of prior agreements with sheriff's departments, and during Hurricane Katrina they were the only means of communication for their whole parish, their whole county, to the outside world, because everything else had collapsed. This is just a voluntary organization working with local emergency managers. So part of the way that they and other people can get involved is by taking these online courses through FEMA. These are independent study courses open to the public, and if all of these amateur radio people are up to date on their communication courses, then you can be sort of get the rubber stamp to work with FEMA during an emergency. And this is part of what the clubs do, is they make sure that their people are up to date on their certifications needed to work during an emergency. And it's just good standardized communication methods of communication. You can also get an amateur radio license, and this is the American Radio Relay League, and you can type it in. You can find anywhere where they're going to have a class to get your amateur radio license in the nation, and to get you information about the individual courses, how to study, what to bring to your test, and things like that. So there's a lot of easy information out there on how to get your license and learn more about it, available at these URLs. So in the future, I'd say there's great need for continuing partnerships with FEMA and organizations like the Coast Guard Auxiliary. These things tap into an available resource that is very robust in a time of disaster. You combine that with a little bit of internet connectivity, and you can have a lot of communication set up very quickly in a time when most other things are just flattened on the ground. Best way to continue this course is to have training, support, memorandums of understanding to enforce consistency throughout the nation during times of disaster. There may be problems in the future with language. And I put language in quotes because it could mean English, Spanish, and French. It could also mean standardized radio communication language, which can be overcome with training, but that's part of the reason for having the standardized FEMA courses, which are important for that. Yeah, and then of course there's security concerns. The amateur radio folks don't get secure frequencies, can't move secure information, but unless they have an agreement, for example, that the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary does, because they go through a lot of training and security checks. So that would be a good thing as a takeaway to things to develop for the future, for myself as a future emergency manager and anyone else thinking about emergency management wherever they live. Figure out who can access information, and if the only people who can move it can't know about it, that would be a spot to work on. So that's something that I would encourage all emergency managers to do, is to develop radio as a means of emergency communication, and to develop the people that work with it in your area, because it's a great resource to have. So let me know if you have any questions.